Hello guys, today I kind of wanted to just go over the sigils in Granblue Fantasy because in all honesty, most people haven't really gone through and explained what each of the sigils do, if they're good, what kind of use cases they have. And while it is impossible to see, or it is impossible to know exactly every single situation that each sigil can be used in, I'm going to give you a really good idea of when you should be using these sigils, where it can be helpful. Let's get into it. First things first, please ignore the little thing on the side because I can't help it. This is the only wiki that has all of the sigils in literally the history of ever. So let's just quickly go through all of the sigils that are currently on screen. Comparing 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 is, come on, let's be real. Really? We're not really looking for that. And ultimately, at some point, if you're looking for a tier list in terms of sigils, it's pretty much just going to come down to whether you're looking for Aegis versus, attack down versus a resistance versus dizzy resistance, etc, etc. So long story short, we're just going to compare the 5 variations to the 5s. And I do want to preface that although there is a lot of value to knowing whether certain class sigils are good, so for this case, we're just going to ignore all of them and just say that they're all pretty usable in one way or another. Let's move on. Okay, so the first sigil that we have here is Aegis 5, and ultimately this is one of the sigils that are a little bit weird, just because there aren't that many characters in the game specifically that want a load of HP as opposed to just stacking damage, stacking cooldown reduction, stacking dodges, etc. But in any case, most characters don't actually see a lot of value when it comes to upgrading Aegis. Obviously, you have certain characters that could use a lot of health, and especially if you're doing the AFK, I don't want to get one-shot build, there are a lot of uses for Aegis. I myself have a max Aegis on my Vasaraga just because I want to get as much health as possible. Don't want to get one-shot. That is the more prominent or practical usage that I actually have for Aegis. Not saying it's not worthwhile to have health. However, with the way that the Terminus weapons work, you can't actually exceed a certain amount of health, which means that stacking too many health pluses or stacking too many Aegises is not really that good. Long story short, you're probably going to use it to AFK. Okay, now another thing that I am going to preface here is kind of what happens when we start talking about resistances. Because the thing is that we do have attack down resistance here. And ultimately, I will flicker on screen like a couple of the bonuses, or you can kind of check for yourself what is really worthwhile when it comes to investing in some of these sigils. When it comes to Aegis, again, you get a decent amount of health, and I'll kind of make note of when it's important to get max level of some of these sigils as opposed to just getting like a sprinkle, like 15. Okay, so the next sigil that we have to talk about is attack down resistance, and the thing about resistances in general, and I kind of just want to explain really quick, is that although you see right here that the quote-unquote max sigil effect for level 15 is a minus 70% effect duration, for many of the resistances, basically once you max it out or you get level 30 or whatever the max sigil effect is for the respective resistance, a lot of these resistances end up making you immune from specific debuffs or from ailments. In this case, you will not be able to be attack downed, and here's where there's a bit of a dilemma. Now obviously there's some great value to not being attack downed, and that's terrific. However, how often you'll actually be applied or how often you will actually get hit by these attack down or specific ailments is pretty far and few, and ultimately it's not really worth it to take 2 sigils in order to max out this resistance and gain minus 100%. The exception to this is slow immunity, and that is super helpful if you're specifically fighting the evil Blackworm. Slow immunity is definitely helpful when it comes to fighting one of the dragons because they just throw on the ground, there's puddles, and ultimately it's not like a burn, it's not like a lightning puddle or something. You kind of just have to sit there and there's a load of them on the ground. It's not really ignorable. In that situation only, I would say that the resistance is pretty justified. Long story short though, attack down is not really that worth it. There aren't that many monsters or that many bosses that actually apply it. And even if there are, most of the time you have an attack buff to combat it or you just dodge it. Now the counterpart to attack down is attack power, and while this is definitely more of a controversial sigil, especially because if you just look at the max sigil rate right there, it says it's plus 40. Here's something that they don't actually tell you or not many people actually look into when it comes to the sigil, and that's that when you look at the plus 15, 40 attack is certainly nothing to write home about, but if you just keep scrolling down and down, okay, like you're at 25, you got 160, probably still not worth it, but you scroll a little bit further, now you have plus 30 and you have 350 attack. Ultimately, not the greatest still, but if you decide to go even further, should you decide to, I don't know, for some reason get 45 attack or 48 if you're using the Terminus weapon, that is 1700 attack, which is a far cry from the original 40 or even the, the 200, 300 that you get from having 2 of the sigils. Now, let me be clear. Attack is definitely usable in certain situations where you have something like flight over fight. However, in most cases, having something like combo booster, tyranny, stamina, life on the line, a lot of these are just better, or you probably have more value in just getting something like nimble onslaught, cascade, quick cooldown, etc, etc. The value of those sigils or traits as opposed to the 3 or so sigil or traits that you'd have to invest to get attack power is normally more than enough to justify not picking attack. But for me, with the Lancelot build and with having flight over fight, there are a few situations where just because of the way that my sigils roll, it does make sense for me to run something like flat attack instead of combo booster, just because I don't have combo booster for some of these other sigils or these rare main stats. Long story short, don't count out attack power, especially if you aren't able to get some of the other more prominent damage traits like life on the line or combo booster, tyranny, stamina, etc. 1700 attack is 1700 attack at the end of the day, and ultimately if it helps you reach the cap, it helps you reach the cap. But just make sure to actually look through your sigils and see what you have, as opposed to just forcing attack just because it says attack, because in all honesty guys, this is not that good of a sigil. Okay, auto revive is probably a no-brainer. This is one of the best early progression and honestly even into mid to late game progression sigils that you can get on the market. If you're stalling or trying to understand the mechanics of a boss, or sometimes your team is just slacking and they're forcing you to fight unexpected boss mechanics, this is one of the sigils that when paired alongside stuff like Guts and Potion Hoarder allows you to really stall out the fight just by yourself and kind of power through stages that you otherwise would have failed. Now it reads here that at max rank, which is 15 for one single sigil, you're ready for activation after 170 seconds, but should you decide to get 5 from your right stone, you actually make this cooldown at level 20 come down to 2 minutes and 120 seconds, or 2 minutes aka 120 seconds, which is really valuable again if you're stalling or if you're trying to sustain. So ultimately, if you find that you need something like Guts and auto revive early, consider slotting this in. Although, and the reason why I slotted this sigil as specifically a progression in mid to early to late game kind of progression sigil is because later on it actually takes a little bit too much time to revive, which kind of causes a hindrance if you're just trying to do speedruns, or if you're just trying to get back up and keep your combo booster or anything like that, which is why a lot of people actually prefer to either just get downed instantly and then use their potion, or they prefer to use something like Guts and make sure that they don't get hit the next time. We'll go a little bit further into Guts and why I think it's kind of maybe one of the most controversial or maybe one of the most misunderstood sigils in the game. For this, I think that especially early, definitely consider taking auto revive, and if you are considering AFKing or doing something like this, auto revive is really OP as well. Great sigil. Now I'll keep it short and sweet because again, this is one of the resistance kind of sigils and there isn't much to say about this. There are a few bosses in the game that apply blight, and whether or not you actually need 2 of these sigils, so a total of 30 trait, in order to completely prevent yourself from either taking the effect or from reducing the amount of damage that you take from this, it's kind of cope. You should probably just dodge the blight. It doesn't really make sense for you to take this if you're just going to dodge the blight anyways. So long story short, not really worth it. Let's move on. Okay, now Break Assassin is definitely an interesting damage sigil because if I read this right, what it should say is that it deals more damage to a foe that's in break, and it should go beyond whatever your typical damage cap is to specifically increase how much damage you do during break, and again, kind of go beyond the normal damage cap boundaries that you have. Otherwise, why would you have a damage increase specifically for a phase where you can't even increase or go beyond whatever the typical damage cap is, or whatever the limitations are for the fight in general? Long story short, Break Assassin should read that when you are in a break phase, no matter if you are hitting your damage cap, you should exceed the damage and be able to either apply a special effect like a paralyze or do more stun power during break effects or during break phases. You should either gain more damage or you should have a special effect associated with break. Long story short, Break Assassin should say that you have a damage cap exceeding boost when it comes to hitting bosses or hitting monsters that are in their break phase, but it doesn't. And it doesn't have any other special effect like you take reduced damage from break, which also could have been something that you would have maybe used to pair alongside something like Stout Heart and Steel Nerve. But long story short, the sigil is pretty niche. I haven't found a great use for this, as opposed to, again, just slotting in damage, glass cannon, something else to kind of bridge the gap. And again, you're not going beyond the damage cap, so I don't know what this is for. Let's move on. Cascade is actually a very interesting case because it is definitely good, but based on who you talk to or what main you talk to, kind of like how good or how bad it is kind of fluctuates up and down. There are certain people that live in, you know, there are a lot of people that swear by it because, again, they got a lot of flurries, or they find a certain boss that you need specific cascades. There are people that will swear by it because certain fights need it, or you need to hit certain cooldowns and they want to make everything kind of seamless. But then there are also people that find that ultimately sometimes the boss is moving around too much, so you don't get as much value as opposed to getting something like Stout Heart, or you could probably just gain the same value from, you know, slotting in primarily just quick cooldown and getting something like Nimble Onslaught, and getting something else like Auto Revive, Guts, or, you know, Potion Hoarder. Ultimately though, I think getting at least 15 of Cascade is really good, and the main reason is because, as you can see with Cascade at rank 15, it says that it gives you a minus 1.5% skill cooldown every time that you hit the boss. And personally, I would take Cascade at least at rank 15 because, as it reads here, it reduces your skill cooldown by 1.5% whenever you hit a foe. And the reason why specifically people will say that it doesn't scale that well, or you might not want to slot in, again, like a Rightstone specifically for this, is because in exchange for a Rightstone slot, all you're gaining is 0.5%, which again is pretty decent if you're talking about a super long or a major fight. However, in most cases, just getting 15 and then slotting in something like damage, or I don't know, Nimble Onslaught, Guts, Auto Revive, something like that on your Rightstone, or double damage cap if you can find that, is super helpful. That being said though, if you want to slot in, you know, 5, or, you know, if you want to get Cascade, it is what it is. That's fairly fine. However, I find that at least at 1.5%, and while trying to chase this double damage cap, it's fairly worth it to just have it like this. That being said, I've definitely seen a lot of people with crit, and then Guts, and then also an ending of Cascade. If you read Charge Attack, you definitely understand the characters, or you can kind of understand the idea behind why they wanted to include this sigil into the game. However, again, just with the nature of damage cap and the way that certain skills kind of scale, a lot of the Charge Attack end up kind of capping fairly easily, or you don't have to spend so much time specifically on just the Charge Attack sigil as opposed to getting stuff like Life on the Line or Glass Cannon. And with that in mind, Charge Attack is very often not that great, especially when you can already slide in other damage sigils. Even for a character like Narmaya, who, again, definitely has a lot of value when it comes to charge attacks and using Setsuna, this sigil doesn't provide nearly as much value, again, as something like Quick Charge, or something, or other sigils that provide utility, or give her some more evasion or more tankiness. With that in mind, the sigil is not that good when it comes to damage, probably not worth taking. This next sigil is actually kind of funny, because Combo Booster basically replaces my main, Lancelot's, one of his class sigils, which is really funny because the class sigil for Lancelot literally reads, gradually boosts damage of each successive hit, and it caps at a 50% total max increase, whereas for Combo Booster it says gradually boost damage of each successive hit with a max of 70%. So in other words, there's no real reason to ever take White Dragon's Glory instead of just taking Combo Booster, unless if for whatever reason you're trying to find something else on the Glory, since it's a class sigil instead of a orange damage sigil. But if that's not the case, Combo Booster is pretty insane, and even if that's not the case, a 70% bonus for a Combo Booster at level 15 is super crazy. All you need to do is continuously hit the boss, and if you're fighting anything in Granblue Fantasy right now, you need to be consecutively hitting over and over and over. Dropping your combo or not having uptime when it comes to hitting is pretty bad. So therefore, since that situation doesn't come up that often, except for, I guess, during certain transition phases, feel free to take damage boosters should you need to increase your damage, alongside something like Stamina, Tyranny, Life on the Line, etc, etc. Now, not to be mistaken by Combo Booster, Combo Finisher is fairly decent because what it essentially does is it allows you to end certain strings of combos or flurries with a significant damage nuker. However, again, unlike some of the other scaling damage sigils, there's no real reason to take this as opposed to something that in general just increases your damage. That being said, there is a Vasaraga build where you actually aren't able to cap out on his damage. I have seen people take Less is More 5 in order to reach this damage threshold. Combo Finisher 5 in this case may also help. However, taking something like Stamina, Tyranny, Less is More, and Glass Cannon will do the same, so keep that in mind, but it is something they're worth consider. That being said, super niche. Concentrated Fire is another sigil that is fairly worth looking into because, as it reads, what it says is that it boosts the power of range attacks, and since it is an increase of 35% at 15, it is fairly worth looking into. But a main flaw of these sigils, and something that you're probably familiar with at this point, is that farming for a level 15 variation of each sigil is kind of ridiculous, and it requires a lot of resources and sitting in front of a slime. With that being the case, if you ever want to use several different variations of loadouts, Concentrated Fire does not work on melee characters, so therefore if you want to save some resources, you could just upgrade stuff like Life on the Line, And I'm gonna sound like a broken record, but stamina and tyranny because they just are that strong. Those sigils are versatile and are popular for a reason, mainly because they can be used on all different characters. Don't take my word for it. Look at literally anyone's build that basically shows off their stats or whatever their traits are. It's there for a reason. Concentrated fire, though, is definitely not the worst thing in the world. Unlike any other of these sigils on this list, Crabby Resonance is really interesting because it's one of like the unique side minigame treasure hunt kind of sigils, where essentially you have to find these wee pincers, and once you get 45 of them, you get 1,000 attack. Everything pretty much up until that point is not worth it. It gives you like upwards of 50, 60, 70 attack, and then they start scaling higher and higher until you get 1,000 attack. Now, by itself, 1,000 attack does sound like a lot. However, since this cannot have an additional trait, it's not really worth it. And unlike something where like you can get 3 levels of flat attack, just giving up an entire slot just for Crabby Resonance, like 1,000 attack, that's not really worth it. However, it is kind of funny if you want to run it. By all means, if you want to catch all the wee pincers as well for a collection, go for it. Critical damage, similar to Concentrated Fire, also provides a 35% attack. And ultimately, although you do gain some value from, again, having critical damage 5, there are a number of characters that don't necessarily rely specifically on crit. In those cases, say it with me, guys, tyranny and stamina is just better. Now, ultimately, you can argue that in some cases, having the critical damage is better than something like tyranny or stamina because it's not condition based. And critical damage, unlike Concentrated Fire, is not limited to specifically just ranged. However, from what I've been told, I'm not exactly sure what the reading, I don't know if it's a bug or what exactly it is. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. I did read that the scaling of critical damage 5 is actually incorrect, or it doesn't play nice, or it actually ends up doing less damage than tyranny, even at the specified, like, you know, even at the maximum like threshold when it comes to damage. I have no way to really verify this because I myself have never really used critical hit damage. But in theory, if you do have critical damage 5 and you are receiving 35% damage, it looks solid. It's fine enough. It's not locked behind, you know, specifically needing ranged or specifically needing melee. All you basically need is to crit. And for a majority of the characters in Granblue Fantasy Relink, they all crit, so consider using this. However, just be careful. Again, I don't know specifically what the details of the bug is or how people read critical damage 5 to be worse than tyranny and stamina, even though, again, I had originally thought that there was good value to having critical damage 5. That being said, though, keep an eye out. If you need to use it, especially early on, it's totally fine to use it. Critical hit rate 5 is pretty much the cornerstone of every single damage build in the game right now, just because you need crit. It is fairly straightforward to get 100 crit rate if you just have 20 crit from Overmastery, if you have 10 crit from your Right Stone, and you also have a singular critical hit rate 5. With that in mind, it is important to have at least one of these at max rank. So considering that, you definitely want to pair this. And since you can also have a damage trait associated with a white trait or with a stat trait like stun power, crit rate, or attack, this sigil is really valuable. Probably one of the best sigils in the game, since it's pretty much just mandatory to get 100 crit rate. I'm sure I didn't have to tell you this one, but make sure you at least have one of these in your build at all times. Damage cap is damage cap. If you aren't already familiar with what this is or why it's important, this is what you need to upgrade to max in order to get the most out of your build when it comes to damage. There's a couple different ways to get max damage cap. I won't go too far in depth with this, but just know that although the most ideal way for people to get damage cap level 65 right now is to have 4 damage cap 5s in addition to maxing the Terminus weapon where you get a level 5 trait, there are actually different ways to get damage cap level 65. I have a 400 hours video where I talk about my specific build and how I actually got technically damage cap level 64. Although it's supposed to be 65, I just got a little unlucky. It is what it is. Dark Flame resistance, see any of the other resistances. I'm gonna get both of these out at the exact same time. I didn't realize how many of these were back to back to back. Defense down resistance, same as everything else. It's pretty much not really something that you'll encounter, not really worthwhile. You're gonna get hit anyways. Dizzy resistance is actually not like the others because if you read it, it says that you should, in theory, be immune to dizzy if you have it at max rank. And I thought to myself very cleverly, well, what if I run this alongside glass cannon? Surely I don't get dizzied. But that's literally not how the interaction works, which is really unfortunate, and that basically makes this worthless. Why would you have this otherwise? Okay, now while dodge payback is definitely good, there are some caveats to kind of consider when it comes to dodge payback, which is that although you do get to extend your invincibility and you do also gain attack percent, there's two things that you need to remember, and that's number one, that extending invincibility does not stack among the other, invincibility stacking effects. In other words, you can't have something like nimble defense and nimble onslaught together. But secondly, when it comes to the attack percent increase, you need to specifically be checking how much damage you gain for each and every single one of your skills, because again, if you're already damage capped, the attack percent literally does nothing. And if that's the case, then there's no reason to take dodge payback. You should just be running something like quick cooldown or cascade in order to actually gain value from cooldown and then get more skills out, which effectively makes you do more damage instead of just being capped by, damage and like this artificial attack increase. Drain is definitely one of these sigils that when you're progressing, or if you just randomly have it on your right stone, it kind of helps, and it's kind of funny because you just get to heal up sometimes when you're in a really bad spot, or when you're soloing, or when your back's against the wall. But unfortunately, as funny and as useful in some occasions, or as much as you'd like to cope about how good Drain is in certain situations, if you're just playing out the end game, most of the times you're not supposed to be getting hit. You just beat up the boss fast enough that the boss just explodes, so therefore Drain isn't worth it. You don't actually need that much health, so therefore if you need something, you can either get more dodge frames, or again, you could be tankier with Stout Heart, but you definitely don't need Drain because you're just going to get one shot anyway. Enmity is the counterpart to Stamina, and although it actually does seem pretty appealing, it's a little bit unfortunate that the way that you gain the bonuses from Enmity is specifically by being low, because ultimately in this game, there's only a few characters that actually can stay at a low health and actually gain the value of this, and that's Vasaraga, who obviously gains a little bit of damage when he has a skill that turns him immortal. But for everyone else, there's no reason, again, not to just take Stamina or literally combo booster, anything else in between. Needing to be at that specific 1% threshold instead of max health, because again, you're dodging, or just gaining flat out damage bonuses from other sources or other scaling sigils makes this specific sigil pretty not worth it. If they buff it in the future, it might be nicer, again, if the base is, or if the attack percent base is higher. However, just because of the way that it's worded and the way that it's supposed to scale, not really worth it. And again, if I'm being honest, I'm kind of used to like the Final Fantasy terminology. I thought that Enmity was supposed to do what like Provoke did. That's not even what this is. Not really worth it. Okay, so the next one that we have is Exploiter, and as it reads and kind of what the word means, you basically exploit the boss, or you increase damage against its weak points and attacks from behind. This is something that you may take as a right stone, or you may have as like a main stat when it comes to your right stone. However, this is actually not really that worthwhile, especially because, again, if you're just running max damage cap, pretty much any other damage boosting sigil will not make your conditional damage locked behind a certain positional or needing to hit the boss at a certain spot. And although a lot of people will end up hitting bosses in the back anyways, just because it feels natural, and that's the way that we've pretty much been programmed to play games like this, the more conditions that you put on yourself, the worse. That's why Exploiter is not that good, and which is why most people actually prefer Vitality right stones instead of those right stones. Fast Learner early on is fairly decent just because it does give you a bit of EXP early on. However, you kind of zoom through the story and get to the point where you hit level 100 fairly quickly anyways. So I personally don't find Fast Learner as much of a priority, especially now where lobbies and carries and stuff are super common. That being said, if you're playing solo and you want to upgrade, or you want to have a couple characters that have Fast Learner on so that they level up quicker, if you aren't getting the spell books, or you aren't, farming out the slime peed, this is something that you could definitely run on some of your AI or for some of the characters that you have. I don't really recommend it though, because it takes less than 10 slime peed runs in order to basically get any of your characters to level 100. Not really that worth it. It's not Rupee Tycoon. It's not Path to Mastery. It is what it is. Okay, if I'm being honest with you, I originally had Firm Stance at max because what it reads is that it reduces, or it makes you immune to the effect of being pulled in or being repelled by physical forces, which sounds good in theory, but then you realize that once you start playing characters that actually need to get into melee range, if you aren't already perfect dodging the pushback or things like this, you're pretty much going to get one shot and get, pushed away or get downed anyways. So you basically have to rely a lot of times on the evasion or like the dashes within the game anyways. It's not really worth it for you to try and resist it. Certain people take stuff like Stout Heart, which is much different than Firm Stance when it comes to what you're actually preventing yourself from being interrupted by. But a push or a pull or like a repel is not really the same. And so therefore, although I definitely could see the value of having Firm Stance if I randomly had it on like my sub 5 pluser or my fighter flight, don't really invest in this, guys. Garrison, like a lot of the other health or defense boosting specific sigils, is really nice if you are, again, trying to AFK. However, for most cases, since it's specifically based on how low your health is, in more practical terms, unless if you're running something super defensive based, which again is maybe a little bit more common for a build like id, but not common in nearly any other build, this sigil is not that usable. If you want to use this or pair this on a character when you're doing AFKs, that's totally fine, but playing defensive is not really the name of the game when it comes to Granblue Fantasy, and there's a good chance you already know this because ultimately everyone likes doing damage and clearing fast. Glaciate resistance, unlike most of the other resistances, and kind of similar to slow resistance, is kind of usable in case if you are fighting the specific ice dragon fight where there's a lot of ice puddles on the ground and you can't deal with all the ice and you don't want to deal with all the ice in general. If that is the case, you could definitely slot in 2 glaciate resistances. This one is a little bit more prominent, and again, with most resistances, if there are consistent or like constant AoEs on the ground that you aren't able to really ignore or bypass, that's when I think resistances are a little bit more justifiable to take. That being said, you could also just argue at the exact same time that don't get hit or just be good. And in those cases, you're probably right. You don't really need a resistance in that case, and Glaciate resistance is no different. Guard payback, like dodge payback, is also interesting because again, it does increase your invincibility timer. However, again, the likelihood of you trying to time a perfect guard as opposed to just holding guard and, you know, blocking damage, and more so even than that, being able to take advantage of the attack percent increase is pretty rare. I don't think it's really that worth it to have guard payback in my opinion, mostly because again, people that do use guard, they kind of do it very sparingly, or they just hold down guard because they're trying to avoid something entirely. And even more so than that, if you can't make use of the attack percent, what's the point of this at all? Okay, now Guts is really interesting, and I think this is definitely somehow one of the most underrated and also overrated sigils in the entire game, and here's why. Guts reads that you survive a lethal hit with 1 HP, and the reactivation time is shortened based on trait level. So when I first started playing Granblue Fantasy, Guts was really nice and I loved it. It was super crazy. And although at the very beginning, something that I kind of thought when it came to Guts was, oh, well, you know, auto revive is just better. You know, Guts lets me get put to like 1 HP, but I want full HP, or if I get downed, you know, like I need auto revive and some of these other ones. And then, like, you know, Guts was nice in theory. It kind of gave me a little bit of time to survive, but like, it is what it is. I kind of wanted auto revive, but then later on I realized that I wanted faster runs. Toss away the auto revive, just run Guts because it lands me at 1 HP. But then I realized that certain bosses in the game pretty much just double tap you, and in all honesty, if you're gonna get downed, you're gonna get downed. And pretty much when it comes to Granblue right now, if you aren't perfect dodging, or if you aren't basically perfect blocking, you're basically going to get downed anyways. So based on these experiences, Guts is definitely good, especially when you're progressing. However, at some point, I think you kind of have to open your eyes and just accept that if you're gonna get hit, you're gonna get hit and you're gonna get downed, and you are going to have to pop a revive potion. And while I definitely am never going to say that Guts is bad, I've definitely seen people forego Guts in exchange for something like Nimble Onslaught, quick cooldown, more offensive leaning sigils, and they kind of just bite the bullet. When they get downed, they get downed. It is what it is, because especially if you're fighting someone like Magliel, or if there's stuff on the ground, you're gonna get hit, sent to 1 hit, and then you're just gonna get hit again and you're downed, which makes literally no sense for you to have Guts anyways. So long story short, use it if you want to. It's great for progressing. However, I think especially in the late game, you'll probably get rid of it. Okay, now while health definitely doesn't sound like the worst sigil in the world, you definitely have to remember that with the Bahamut weapons or the Terminus weapons, you are only allowed to have a certain amount of health when it comes to activating the Catastrophe passive. And with that in mind, how much health you actually get or how much you stack on your build is really important to be considerate of. So while health is definitely nice for something like stacking HP, and if you're just trying to AFK, there aren't that many cases where you would rather have it. There's a lot of combinations like Steel Nerve plus Stout. There's Tyranny plus Aegis. In other words, a load of combinations where you can still get health or you can still get tanky, but you don't need to specifically just run the health sigil and gain a lot of HP. And so with that in mind, I don't think that health is that important or that great right now, especially with the way that people play. And since the Terminus weapons themselves literally restrict how much health you have, it's pretty much only good for AFK runs. Held under resistance, pretty much the same as all the other resistances, not that common. Let's move along. Okay, now here's the thing about improved guard. If you do end up being in a situation where you need to guard, you probably are just holding down the guard button, and rarely if ever do you actually need to increase your guard gauge, because either you could just do a mixture of dodging and guarding, or honestly you could just perfect guard, and honestly improved guard does nothing for you in that case. Okay, now here's the thing about improved dodge. Unlike the next one that we're going to be talking about, which is improved guard, it extends the number of dodges that you can do in a row. So ultimately, if you are using something like nimble onslaught, if you're using flight over fight, all these different dodge or evasion mechanics, it is pretty worth it for you to also have improved dodge if you can fit it into your build. That being said, I know a lot of people that are only able to fit flight over fight or improved dodge, and they don't use both because again you need a lot of damage to compensate for flight over fight. But should you end up using improved dodge, just know that there is great value, because again sometimes you need to be dodging in a row and consecutively, but there are people that would just play Lancelot, uses heavy attack to dodge, and in that case you don't really get that much value out of improved dodge. So therefore, if you just want to use flight over fight, in that case you can do that. However, not everyone is playing Lancelot, so improved dodge definitely has its uses, but just know that if you are going to use improved dodge, you do have to give up another slot, which you'll definitely feel in the long run when you're trying to fit all your damage caps, all your damages, your quick cooldowns, and your cascades. Okay, now unlike improved dodge, improved guard is a little bit more niche, because the likelihood of you specifically needing to increase your guard gauge and how long you can hold guard is pretty uncommon, just because most of the time the boss will not actually break your guard, and you would literally need to get hit 5 or more times for you to even feel scared when it comes to your guard being broken. Another really funny tidbit is that a lot of people don't actually seem to notice, but your shield actually changes colors when you get hit, and you can actually tell when your guard is actually about to break. And in that case, you would just stop guarding, run away, start dodging. And unlike improved dodge, where you get more dodges in a row and you can kind of increase the amount of total utility that you have with a sigil like improved dodge, improved guard does not feel the same, so therefore it's not that good. Improved healing, like some of the other sigils on this list, feel like they don't quite have a home, even though in theory or in concept they sound pretty interesting. Raising the healing cap and increasing the amount of healing that you get from healing skills definitely feels like it should in theory be interesting for a concept, like if you're just trying to improve like a berserker build, or a build where you're just getting healed, or you have a team that supports you. But ultimately, most people are kind of trying to play to this I never get hit, or I perfect dodge everything, or I perfect block everything. So then in that case, there isn't really that much value to, again, having improved healing. If it is something that you randomly find on a right stone, it's okay, but even in that case, you would probably want something like Drain instead. So unfortunately, until Cygames buffs or adjusts to this, I don't actually think that improved healing will find much use for most players. Unfortunate. Insult to Injury is definitely kind of a weird sigil, mainly because with a lot of these sigils that are damage oriented but have a condition to them, it really feels like there was supposed to be a higher payoff for activating the conditions to utilize these passives. For instance, for Insult to Injury, you could see that what you get is 22% damage increase at rank 15, but it reads that you only gain this attack bonus when the boss is status afflicted. And although defense down and stuff like that is definitely common among a lot of the characters in the game, you could literally just use something like critical hit damage, or even something like concentrated fire if you're ranged, and gain a higher bonus to damage. Now, I do also wish that Cygames was a little bit more, I guess, explanatory, or gave you a little bit more information about exactly how things scaled, or how good some of these sigils were in terms of the raw damage, and you didn't just have to go to the target dummy. But thankfully, there are things like the damage calculator online. Thank you and credits to the people that make them. However, in terms of what you read on the card or the wiki, or basically what you see in game, this sigil is pretty worthless compared to any of the other damage sigils, just because it's less conditional. Life on the Line is definitely a sigil that I've been kind of broken record repeating over and over, and I apologize. However, I cannot stress enough how important it is to have this specific sigil, especially because most of the time, while people will use something like blue potions for increasing your link attack, there isn't that much usage in terms of AoE healing or spreading healing between the party, especially when you're trying to go for a speed run. 39% attack at 15 is definitely nothing to scoff at, and ultimately, since again most of the time you won't really be receiving the effects of healing from allies anyways, unless if you're obviously running someone like Caligostro, in which case you're probably just doing AI. This sigil is definitely one of the better options if you're just trying to get attack and increase your damage. So if you're looking for another damage sigil to invest in, guys, this is definitely a decent one. Although, again, as I mentioned with some of the other damage sigils, I would definitely slot in Stamina and Tyranny first, and then look for something like this after. Link together is definitely a win more sigil, and there's a couple reasons for it. First and foremost, as you read, it says that it increases your link damage, your SBA damage, your link level gain, and also your chain burst damage. But ultimately, whether or not you're actually going to make use of link attacks is kind of dependent on your allies. So if you are someone that is either running this solo, or if you're trying to run like a solo build, no value really to having linked attack. But if you are running a more simulated or a more controlled group where you have a bunch of allies and you know when they're going to use their link attacks, their SBAs, etc., this is pretty good. Low profile, in my opinion, is definitely somewhat more of an interesting sigil because what it reads is that foes are less likely to target you, which is great sounding on paper. However, alongside some of the other sigils in the game that, again, sound great on paper but are not that great in practice, low profile does not prevent you from, again, having AoEs on the ground, having the boss randomly like ram into you like Narbanju, who just spins around the whole area. And in terms of what you actually want, if you are trying to stay low profile, there is definitely better value or an argument to be made for other characters on your team, like the AIs having provoke instead, or again, you kind of just tanking out the damage and you giving yourself another Aegis instead of trying to slot in low profile, or heck, even getting something like a secondary health sigil or a health secondary trait instead of low profile. That being said, if you have nothing else to add, or if you're kind of like skimping and you have like an Aegis or like a garrison that has a low profile associated with it, it's not the worst thing in the world. However, I've definitely had max profile for the entire time that I've been running my AFK strat, and I get hit anyway. Lucky Charge is actually an interesting sigil, primarily because I definitely see a lot of chatter or conversation about how to min-max the absolute amount of damage that you can get. And now, although some of the other sigils are based in giving you kind of unreasonable amounts of stats, like you lose a sigil slot and when all the stars align you gain like 20 or 30% attack. 54% critical hit rate at rank 15 for Lucky Charge is actually kind of interesting. Now let me be clear, I understand this isn't damage, you also still have to abide by, again, your built-in crit rate, but I can definitely understand or theorize a build where you don't run any critical hit rate in your build, whether that be through sigils or through your Rightstone. And if you are someone that only uses charge attacks to deal damage, there is definitely a situation where, again, 54% crit rate at level 1, that basically means that you don't need any crit rate anywhere else. And again, if you can slot this as something like a secondary sigil on a stun power, you can definitely run a build where you just have more stun power and you don't really rely on running crit in your build or running crit on your Rightstone. And then you just make use of the Lucky Charge and getting critical hit rate just from Lucky Charge itself. 54% crit rate is nothing to scoff at, because again, if you recall, a max rank critical hit rate only puts you at 29 crit rate. Nimble defense, unlike its counterpart, is definitely the worst of the two, primarily because what it reads is that it boosts your defense and restores a small bit of health, in addition to extending invincibility after a perfect dodge. And while again, extending invincibility is always good, increasing your defense and increasing your health after you do a dodge is not really going to save you from getting one shot. What will save you from getting one shot is inevitably just clearing out the run, which is, again, we'll talk about with the next sigil. However, again, I've run Nimble Defense alongside Nimble Onslaught, and what I will say is that if both of these were to stack, in other words, if you give yourself 9 seconds of dodge or even longer than that, this would be really insane and super great, especially because, again, you give yourself a little bit of defense and a little bit of flexibility in terms of health. However, ultimately, since that's not the case and all you're really giving yourself is just the dodge and the health, it doesn't really make sense for you to give up an entire slot or put another 30 points into Nimble Defense when you already need to put 30 points into Nimble Onslaught. Long story short, it's not really worth it. If you have it, it's fine. If you want to just by itself, give yourself 6 seconds of invincibility instead of 3, but I would definitely not recommend it, especially later game. Maybe decent for early progression, definitely not worth it later. Okay, now Nimble Onslaught, unlike, again, its counterpart, is definitely one of the best sigils in the game. It gives you SBA gauge gain, it gives you skill cooldown, it gives you invincibility, and long story short, although there aren't that many utility or offensive cooldown leaning sigils aside from, again, Cascade, quick cooldown, and something like Nimble Onslaught, and the ones that do give you offensive leaning capabilities are really good. Now again, you definitely don't need to slot level 30 of this trait. If you just have it on your character, it's fine. However, like I mentioned, there aren't actually that many offensive sigils that you can pair alongside an orange damage sigil outside of, again, Nimble Onslaught, Cascade, and quick cooldown. So if you want to put these together, you definitely should, and it probably is the one that you will end up getting 30 of, especially if you're playing someone like Yordaha, Lancelot, or if you're using any dodge-based character. But more than anything else, just finding an additional source of skill cooldown and SBA gauge gives you just more damage overall in terms of, just in terms of how frequently you can use more skills. If that rotates more of your link skills or rotates more of your damage, then so be it. This is definitely a great offensive sigil. Definitely top 10 in the game. Like Break Assassin, Overdrive Assassin is a little bit weird because, again, what you have here is a sigil that in theory should do something special, like decrease the amount of damage that you get done or exceed the damage cap when you're in overdrive phase. This sigil does none of those, and unfortunately it is just a specific damage increase. It does give you 70% damage increase should you only be fighting against a boss in overdrive. However, again, the frequency that you'll be specifically fighting someone in overdrive is not enough for you to actually justify taking this off and getting rid of something like life on the line, stamina, or tyranny. You've heard it once, you've heard it 1,000 times. Those are the goats. This is conditional. Welcome to Granblue Fantasy. Paralysis resistance, again, though interesting or cool in theory, is not really that usable because none of the major characters that you'd be fighting or farming like Maglio Galanza or even someone like Proto Bahamut will actually stun you. Not really worth mentioning. I guess if you're fighting the White Dragon, you can maybe use this, but just dodge. It's not worth it to slot into this. Let's move on. Path to Mastery is really good for progression, and later on, it is something that you definitely want to put on your AI if you are starting to do stuff like Slime Pete to farm. In essence, it just gives you more mastery points. That's all it is, and you can give it to online players in your party. But 15% increase in mastery points is pretty decent, and again, if you're using this on your allies and stuff, you farm out more mastery points, you get capped faster, you get to reroll your over mastery faster. It's obviously not great for damage because that's literally not what it's for. It's just for, kind of metagaming and utility and getting to a faster or more efficient build later, but definitely is worth getting a few copies of the sigil and laying them around or just keeping them in your inventory for whenever you need to farm. I definitely would use this on my Eugen or some of my other, AI specific characters that I use to farm. And it's kind of self-explanatory. You don't really need stuff like, perfect dodge or anything like that when it comes to these AI. You don't really need to affect them that much, especially if you're just trying to, again, just stun a boss and just have it instantly blow up. You might as well just get the Path to Mastery. Therefore, it's really good. Although in the end game of Granblue Fantasy, you don't really need defensive sigils outside of something like Nimble Onslaught, which again, increases your invincibility. There is definitely an argument to be had for Potion Hoarder amongst some of the other defensive sigils like Auto Revive and Guts. And the reason why a lot of people will still take Potion Hoarder instead of Guts or Auto Revive is specifically because when you gain more potions, it actually increases your link attack gauge, which is really, really helpful if you're trying to get out of a pinch or if you're trying to do more damage to certain bosses. And since that's the case, not only do you have kind of a backup in case if you get hit, and then again, you're able to heal yourself, you also have access to essentially to another Nimble Onslaught situation where you have a defensive sigil that also has offensive leaning capabilities. Increasing your link gauge is really helpful because obviously you can enter link time and then you get to spam out all your attacks, do a bunch of damage, and kind of end the fight faster. But ultimately, there are still a lot of people that subscribe to the don't run any sigils that have any defensive leaning capabilities. So keep that in mind when you're considering Potion Hoarder. However, you definitely want it early for progression. And then definitely in like a more rounded or like versatile endgame build, you want Potion Hoarder. Okay, so we just got out of the whole section that had to do with Nimble Onslaught and Nimble Defense. Precise Resilience and Precise Wrath is basically the equivalent to those, but just in the guard form. Now again, it is definitely going to be a little bit harder to time a perfect guard as opposed to a perfect dodge, and just in general, being able to pair a dodge into attack as opposed to like a guard and then having to instantly attack is a little bit more uncomfortable, a little bit less common. So in terms of Precise Resilience, it's definitely just worse because we already weren't taking Nimble Defense, which ultimately would have given you a little bit more flexibility since you're dodging and then you can then hit immediately after. There's no way that you're going to do a perfect guard and then want to then start immediately attacking, and that feels better than Nimble Defense. The health, the defense, not really that worth it. Most of the characters that would guard anyways aren't taking any damage to begin with, so I don't really understand why you would even want the healing from Precise Resilience. Doesn't really make sense. Let's move on. Precise Wrath, like I mentioned with Nimble Onslaught, is kind of interesting in the ways that you could use it, and I could definitely see the viability or the use cases for Precise Wrath, especially because again, it gives you gauge, it helps your perfect dodge, it helps your perfect blocks, it kind of increases the amount of invincibility that you get in general. However, since most people are more inclined to use Nimble Defense, since most people are inclined to use Nimble Onslaught instead, and they're more comfortable using dodges for, number one, moving out of the way, and number two, also because it chains a little bit easier, or there's a little bit more flexibility when it comes to movement. There's no real reason to use Precise Wrath or even Precise Resilience, although if you were to choose between Precise Resilience and Wrath, it's definitely Wrath. Okay, now I mentioned it earlier with low profile, and here we have Provoke, which is essentially the opposite or the counterpart to low profile, which is it increases your, I guess, aggression or the hostility that you have towards the enemy. And again, if you want to put this on your AI instead of your own build so that you can afford to have more health or have more defense, I think that is honestly more ideal than trying to slot low profile or trying to find low profile in your own build. That being said, if you want to also just run both of them where you have maximum hostility on your allies and then have lowest, I guess, hostility on your own build, that definitely also works out in your favor. However, I haven't really found that much value when it comes to low profile as opposed to Provoke. When I put Provoke on all of my allies, I'm basically not hit anyways, or I can basically afford the slots with my AI anyways because I don't have 80 damage caps to begin with. So if that's the case, if I have something like damage cap and Provoke, or if I have a random tyranny with Provoke, it works out better that way for the small bursts of hostility that I would want in my build anyways. However, in general though, hostility is kind of a wild card factor because again, if you're fighting a boss that has a lot of AoEs or just hits everyone, or if there's things on the ground that are going to hit you anyways, there's literally no point to having hostility at all. It's not like it creates like a pocket where they won't hit you and like AoEs won't drop on you. So therefore, if that's the case, and especially since your allies will actually come to your aid and like again just drop AoEs on top of you anyways, it doesn't really feel like hostility is that good. It is what it is though. If you want to run it on some of your AI, you can't. I personally wouldn't though. Okay, now unlike all of the other charges in the game, Quick Charge is actually really interesting because not only does it decrease your charge time, it also gives you an attack increase. Now again, having the decrease in charge time and the attack percent is really great because again, this is kind of reminiscent of something like Nimble Onslaught, Cascade, Quick Cooldown, where again, you're gaining damage while also gaining yourself some utility. This obviously doesn't include any of your utilities. However, again, if you are playing someone like Io, Caligostro, these characters that need to charge up their skills, it is obviously really nice to have minimal charge up time. And again, if you're spamming and dodging around and trying to charge up and like cast as many skills as possible, you're just gonna need quick charge. And while you're at it, it is definitely nice again to have the attack increase, so it doesn't just feel like you're just slotting in quick cooldown and that's it, and you don't have any actual feasible damage increase. Therefore, the 14% attack increase, the 21% charge time, both really nice. I would definitely suggest this again if you're playing any of the mages or the casters, but you guys probably already knew that. There isn't much to say when it comes to quick cooldown. It is really good, it's decent, it gives you a load of damage. It is again just more utility leaning, so if you need it, you have it. But ultimately, it increases again all of your skills, so whether that be a damage buff, whether that be a damage skill, an evasion skill, anything like that, a heal, a revive, whatever it is, immortality. It is what it sounds like. It's quick cooldown, and ultimately it isn't overrated, it isn't underrated, it is perfectly rated, because in 99.99% of cases, there are fights where, again, if you could have gotten off one more skill, one more dodge, or you just had gotten that extra little bit of damage buff, you probably would have been able to beat the boss, and you probably would have benefited from having quick cooldown in your skill. That being said though, for early progression and stuff like this, quick cooldown is not that good because, again, you would rather have something like auto revive or guts or, again, Potion Hoarder. Your cooldowns in the early progression phases of the game are definitely not as important, again, as staying alive, so keep that in mind when you're trying to do progression or when you're going through Maniac and some of these earlier stages. That being said though, if you're a Chad, just take it at level 1. Regen, in my opinion, is fairly underrated, primarily because most people just get it from their Terminus weapon and they just leave it on. However, if you are AFKing and you're kind of not doing anything and you don't have anything else to slot in as your extra sub trait, I actually think that having max regen is kind of funny because it does heal a decent amount, and ultimately if you're just sitting in the corner and you're not getting hit by Narbanju or you're not getting hit by some dragon, you can actually heal a decent amount of health back. And since, again, you're not touching your keyboard, you can't use Potion Hoarder, and some of these other sigils actually cap kind of early, like, again, Auto Revive or Guts, it doesn't make sense for you to basically run anything else. You can't run something like Guard Payback, or you can't run something like Resilience. So therefore, regen is actually pretty funny, especially if you run it alongside improved healing. That being said though, I definitely don't think it's that mandatory. It's pretty much just for AFKing, otherwise you just have it from your Terminus weapon. Okay, now if I had to label a sigil like the most overrated or like maybe the most bait sigil of the entire list, it's Rupee Tycoon. Now again, if you're probably looking at something like Fast Learner or Path to Mastery, you're looking at these sigils and saying to yourself, oh my gosh, wow, like these are really good if you're, you're trying to like min-max or you're putting this on your AI. No, Rupee Tycoon, at least right now, has literally no use because if you're doing any level of farming, rupees kind of don't end up doing anything for you. Now, maybe in the early stages, you have a couple times where you're running out of rupees, and that's okay. However, if you end up doing anything relating farming, or if you start doing Slimepeed, you'll notice that you literally just start accruing like millions upon millions of rupees. And in general, if you really needed rupees, or you really needed this sort of gold currency, all you would have to do is just sell some of your treasures, sell some of the random sigils that you have, and you would get more than enough rupees to sustain any kind of weird endeavor that you're doing. That being said though, I understand the thinking or the idea behind Rupee Tycoon, but as it is right now, and especially once you get later on into the game, however, later on in the game, once you start needing to farm slimes and getting azurite splendors and Damascus ingots, again, what you'll realize is that you are more gated on these as opposed to rupees, and even for upgrading or forging anything in the game, most of these costs are not nearly as gated by anything like drops from bosses, or honestly just having the levels for them. Sand Tomb resistance is only really bad if you're fighting Excavalion for that very like weird phase when you're trying to climb up onto the Excavalian's leg, which again, in my opinion, you should just not be doing Excavalion because I hate that boss, and that boss takes so much time compared to literally every other boss in Granblue Fantasy. But ultimately, the short period or the brief period that you have to try and speedrun and try to beat up like the legs or the bombs in the legs are not really worth it. Just kind of ignore this. It's a resistance. Okay, now Skilled Assault definitely sounds really good on paper, and like I said, it's 70% damage increase, and I could definitely see some sort of build where you just have Skilled Assault in case if you don't already have some of these damage increasing sigils. But ultimately, something that I've noticed from the damage calculator and seeing some of the damage that I've done on some of my skills is that you actually hit the cap, or you actually hit the damage cap on a lot of skills much faster and much quicker than a lot of your normal attacks. And since that's the case, it doesn't really feel right to run this instead of, again, Tyranny Stamina linked together, even if you want to do or increase your SBA gauge and stuff like that. It sounds good on paper. You could definitely run it if you're early on or progressing whenever you have it. It will literally just give you 70% or whatever amount it is in the earlier stages, like up to what, like 50 or even 35% worth of value. But ultimately, in endgame builds, there's no reason to only increase your skill damage. It is what it is. Slow resistance is definitely something that I would definitely consider running if you're fighting against the evil worm that does a bunch of the puddles on the ground, because again, you can't really avoid these things, and if you're trying to hit the boss, he kind of just drops it on the ground. And unless if you're phasing the boss in an insane way where he doesn't even get to drop the slow puddles, this is definitely one of the resistances that is considerable to run for that fight. But ultimately, again, if you're speedrunning that fight, you could also just argue that this isn't even worth running, as opposed to just running a build where you can kind of activate your link gauge faster. It is a resistance, so it isn't that great, but among all the other resistances alongside Glacia and some of the other ones, I definitely consider this to be one of the resistances that I would otherwise consider. But again, damage is king in this game, and if it's not, utility is king. Okay, now we finally reached the part of the list where we get to talk about something like stamina. Okay, now stamina reads that it boosts attack based on how high your health is, and at level 15, you gain a boost of 50% attack and 100% health. Now, if you spent any time playing the game right now, you'd understand that basically, if you're not at 100% health, you're on the ground and you're screaming for help. Since that's the case, 99.99% of the time, you have the 50% attack increase, which is really significant. It's great. I enjoy it. But ultimately, I do understand the thinking when it comes to, oh, well, you only get 7.5% attack when you're at 25% HP. Again, the idea behind Granblue Fantasy is to not get hit, and since that's kind of the case, and since you can just heal up if you want to gain back the stamina boost, there's no real reason not to take stamina. It is one of the most consistent damage sigils in the game, and again, there isn't much to compare this to outside of Life on the Line, or maybe Combo Booster, or I guess Tyranny. But in all seriousness, you would just use all of these together if you want to reach your damage cap, so therefore, stamina really good. Make sure to take it on all your builds. Steady Focus is definitely more of a quality of life sigil, primarily because, again, it does give you Stout Heart and does prevent you from being interrupted by foes' attacks. But ultimately, even for a character like Io, where you do some casting, there is an argument to be made for you to just run Stout Heart instead of Steady Focus, or for you to literally just dodge around and kind of prevent yourself from needing Steady Focus in your build. That being said though, I've heard a lot of caster players or charging attack players say that this is really nice, and ultimately, with that being the case, if you want to run this instead of Stout Heart, I understand. However, Stout Heart alongside Steel Nerves is definitely one of the more common builds for melee characters that don't want to take a lot of damage. If you're ranged though, arguably you could just prevent yourself from getting hit by positioning early or kind of doing some of the animation cancels with dodging. I've seen a lot of IOs do the tech where they kind of dodge and roll and they're casting at the same time, which is really nice, like very helpful. But ultimately, to take Steady Focus instead of just doing that, I don't think it's worth the sigil slot. Use it if you want quality of life though. Okay, the next two that we have are kind of one of the few pairings that I've already been kind of, selling to you guys, which is Stout Heart and Steel Nerves, which most of you guys at this point already know. Steel Nerves reads that you take less damage while Stout Heart is active, and again, minus 15% damage taken is nothing to scoff at, because again, this is unconditional pretty much while you have Stout Heart, if you just have the trait Stout Heart already in. However, if you are running something like Steady Focus or some of the other Stout Heart adjacent sigils that are conditional, it may not be as worth it for you to run Steel Nerves in this case. However, if you are just taking literally Stout Heart by itself, Steel Nerves is definitely worth it, because again, this isn't like something where you have to adjust for the amount of health that you have with the Terminus weapons and Catastrophe. This is just a flat out damage reduction, which is really, really helpful. Really nice if you can fit these two into your build. But ultimately, this is still more of a progression based thing. This is still more of a, I want to tank the boss instead of dodging, which again, you could argue that's a way to play, but most players will definitely try to do either the perfect dodge or the perfect guard playstyle to kind of prevent needing this entirely. Now, if we move along to Stout Heart, what Stout Heart reads is that foes just can't interrupt your attacks, which is really nice, again, if you're doing any charging and you're playing someone like, I don't know, a caster. But ultimately, whether or not you actually choose to take this is kind of dependent just on how likely you are to get hit. If you're doing something like Proto Bahamut, the boss is simply not going to hit you that much, and pretty much it's just a glorified target dummy. So if you're farming that boss, you definitely don't need something like Stout Heart. But if you're doing something like Galanza and Magliel, or if you're doing some of the more tankier fights, or if you're trying to help out your friends in some of the progression or some of the proud missions, I definitely understand the idea behind using Stout Heart and Steel Nerves. However, again, it is pretty much all up to preference at this point for your defensive sigils, and just in general, the defensive sigils are pretty much up to preference, because ultimately you could just perfect dodge, perfect block everything in the game without any of these enhancing effects, and just do that on repeat every time that the boss is about to hit you. The AI do it, so in theory, so could you. Stun power is definitely a little bit less understood compared to some of the other sigils or stat boosts in the game. And while, again, a lot of people already know that attack is not that great, unless if, again, you stack it really high, stun power is definitely somewhat underrated compared to, again, critical hit rate, or definitely ignored more so compared to critical hit rate. But stun power is really nice, especially if you're trying to activate or play a linked attack playstyle. For certain bosses like Proto Bahamut, where you want to skip phases, it is especially important for you to have this linked attack, because again, if the boss is linked attack, he gets staggered for a little bit, you can then bypass certain phases, you could then use your ultimate to skip certain phases, you don't have to deal with annoying cutscenes or transitions. Long story short, if you need to prolong certain phases, or if you need to get into that link attack kind of groove or that cycle of attacking, or if you need to get into that cycle of proccing link attacks, this is definitely a sigil to consider stacking. Some builds that I've seen go upwards to 180, 200, 250, which is really nice, and it kind of breaks the boss really fast. So keep that in mind if you're trying to break phases, or if you're trying to bypass certain phases, or just activate or, you know, stagger the boss in general. Okay, now in all honesty, I was probably going to do its own separate video on this throw thing, because in all honesty, boost damage of thrown objects is pretty lackluster. I don't think anyone has ever really needed to throw an object at someone and one-shot it. Most of the objects in the game kind of already one-shot the enemies that they get thrown by or that you throw them at, so it doesn't really make sense. And also, most stages in the game don't even have throwing objects or have thrown objects that you can interact with anyways. So throw 5 basically makes no sense, but I was gonna see if there was like any justification or any value to actually using these thrown items. It does say that you increase damage dealt by 70%, and if for some reason, I guess if you decide to run this into Evil Worm or some stages where you can, you know, beat up some of the mobs and they become orbs that you can throw at the boss, it may find itself a bit useful. I don't think anyone is going to stop their damage rotation and just pick something up off the ground and then throw it at the boss. It doesn't really make sense. It's a lot of downtime in terms of total damage output, so not really worth it. I will do a bit of experimentation, and if you want, you can leave in the comment section below any of the, you know, any Mythbuster kind of testing ideas that you want. But for throw 5, it's not worth it. It's not really a damage increase. It is what it is. Okay, now finally, we have two of the most important sigils in my opinion, and the first one is Tyranny. Tyranny reads that you gain 35% attack while also losing max HP, which again sounds bad on paper, but it doesn't actually really matter, because again, if you're really worried about your health, you could always slot in another Aegis. But ultimately, what you have here is a damage increase that is unconditional to anything in the game. It just pretty much reduces your health, and if you're already dodging, what does this health matter anyways? Tyranny is one half of the OP dynamic duo when it comes to damage increasing, and ultimately there is no way to replace this outside of something like Life on the Line or Combo Booster. But even in those cases, if there's ever downtime, you kind of lose your combo. If there's a situation where you want to be healed, you also can't get healed when you have life on the line. That being said, those use cases are already kind of niche, but Tyranny is just so good just because of how unconditional it is. It doesn't matter if there's downtime. It doesn't matter if you need the healing or not. All you lose out on is 20% health, and ultimately 30,000 health is basically the same as 40,000 health anyways. It is what it is. I would definitely recommend everyone take Tyranny if you're trying to build out damage on your team. But finally, we have Uplift, and the reason why it's so important is because a lot of times if you're trying to phase certain fights, or if you're trying to do speedruns, you actually do need the SBA gauge gain to go up much quicker so that you can bypass certain phases. You can stun lock or ultimate the boss while they're in overdrive and prevent them from casting their weird transitions or stuff like that. Long story short, if you have max Uplift alongside all of your allies, you have an insane amount of ultimate casting, you have an insane amount of SBA gauge casting. It allows you again to interrupt certain phases. Bahamut is literally a training dummy if you have this on. And again, since there aren't that many things that you can include aside from Cascade, quick cooldown, and stuff like this, this is probably what you would take if you're not a dodge character instead of something like Nimble Onslaught, just because again, you gain so much SBA gauge and it gives you so much value for in terms of your ultimate casted. It's definitely worth it. That's the last sigil that we have on the list though. Anyways, guys, that was every single sigil in the game with a brief explanation. Now, again, I didn't rate these in like a tier list or anything like that because ultimately a lot of these are kind of dependent on your build, the character that you have, and kind of just in terms of value will differ to you based on playstyle. So ultimately trying to put this in like an S, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, whatever kind of tier list doesn't really make sense. But I did kind of want to just go over some of the sigils because I haven't seen anyone go over every single one. And duly noted because this is probably going to be like an hour video or something like that. But I hope you guys learned something because ultimately the sigils are really interesting in this game. I hope that Cygames balances some of them a little bit more or reduces the importance of damage cap because ultimately it does kind of hinder your total build and it does kind of hinder the creativity that you have when it comes to Granblue Fantasy. But ultimately, guys, use this knowledge wisely. I hope you guys enjoyed or you learned something. If you did, make sure to like, comment, turn on the notification bell, and subscribe. Make sure to check out the rest of my socials. Feel free to find me on Twitch or YouTube where I'll probably be playing or streaming this game, answering questions about this game, etc, etc. Thanks again for everyone that's been supporting recently. I appreciate it on the shorts, on the YouTube videos. Thank you so much. I will see you guys on the next one. It's been real. Adios.